The mountain wind carried more than winter's bite that November morning. It carried the scent of a life Jonah Cain had convinced himself he'd never deserve. 8 years of self-imposed exile in these Appalachian peaks had taught him that solitude was safer than hope, that hunger was preferable to disappointment. But when the pregnant widow stepped from that rattling stagecoach, her hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly, something cracked in the fortress he'd built around his heart. He'd paid for a cook and received a teacher of grace instead. Subscribe to witness how love finds us in the wilderness of our own making. Jonah Cain stood in the doorway of Murphy's General Store, his weathered hands gripping the wooden frame, as if anchoring himself against an invisible storm. The November air bit through his wool coat, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice that had settled in his chest 8 years ago. He'd come down from his mountain cabin for supplies and to post a notice, something he'd sworn he'd never do. But the loneliness had grown teeth, gnawing at him through the endless nights, and even a man as stubborn as Jonah had limits. The handwritten sign in his pocket felt heavier than the gold coins he'd brought to pay whoever answered his call. Cook wanted, mountain cabin, winter work, good pay. Simple words that felt like surrender. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and conversations died like snuffed candles. Jonah had that effect on people. His 6-foot frame and granite expression carved silence from crowded rooms. Murphy nodded from behind the counter, his eyes holding the careful respect reserved for dangerous men who paid their debts. Jonah had earned that respect through 8 years of solitary trading, appearing like a ghost every few months to exchange furs and gold for supplies before vanishing back into the peaks. He was a legend in these parts, the mountain man who'd lost everything and chosen exile over healing. But legends, Jonah had learned, were just stories people told to make sense of pain they couldn't understand. He pinned his notice to the board beside advertisements for patent medicines and lost livestock, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the tacks into the wood. The simple act felt like tearing open an old wound, exposing the raw need he'd kept buried beneath layers of pride and self-reliance. A woman's voice behind him made him freeze, soft, musical, carrying the kind of warmth that could melt winter itself. "Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but notice your posting." Jonah turned slowly, expecting to see one of the local farm wives looking for extra income. Instead, he found himself staring into the greenest eyes he'd ever seen, set in a face that belonged in a painting rather than this rough frontier town. She was young, maybe 27, with auburn hair pinned back in a simple bun and a dress that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. But it was her condition that stopped his breath entirely. She was heavy with child, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly, and there was something in her posture that spoke of recent loss. A widow, he realized, recognizing the particular brand of sorrow that clung to those who'd loved and lost. The gold band on her finger caught the lamplight, and Jonah felt something twist in his chest, a recognition of shared pain that he wasn't prepared for. This wasn't what he'd expected when he'd posted that notice. He'd imagined hiring some weathered farm woman, or perhaps a spinster looking for honest work. He hadn't imagined Grace walking into his life wearing a faded blue dress. "Ma'am," he managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The word felt foreign on his tongue. It had been so long since he'd spoken to a woman with anything approaching courtesy. She smiled then, and it was like watching sunrise break over the mountains, slow and inevitable and beautiful beyond description. "I'm Lydia Brown," she said, extending a small, work-worn hand. "I saw your notice, and I believe I might be exactly what you're looking for." Jonah stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, knowing that if he took it, something fundamental would change. He'd spent 8 years building walls, and here was a woman offering to walk through them as if they were made of morning mist. The smart thing would be to tip his hat and walk away, to find someone else, someone who wouldn't threaten the careful numbness he'd cultivated. But Jonah Kane had never been accused of being smart, and as his calloused fingers closed around her soft ones, he felt the first crack in the ice that had surrounded his heart for so long. "Mrs. Brown," he said, and her name tasted like hope on his lips. Dangerous, intoxicating hope that he'd sworn never to taste again. The handshake lasted only seconds, but in that brief contact, Jonah felt something he'd thought was dead forever. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face the winter alone. The mountain wind howled outside Murphy's store, but for the first time in 8 years, Jonah Kane wasn't listening to its lonely song. The stagecoach lurched and swayed up the mountain path like a ship in a storm, and Jonah found himself stealing glances at the woman beside him with each jarring bump. Lydia Brown sat with her hands folded over her belly, her green eyes fixed on the passing landscape with a serenity that seemed impossible given the circumstances. She'd accepted his offer without hesitation, asking only for a day to gather her few belongings and settle her affairs in town. Now, as they climbed toward his isolated cabin, Jonah wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his already mistake-riddled life. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged with unspoken questions and the weight of two people carrying more grief than any soul should bear. "How long have you lived up here?" Lydia asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the creak of wheels and jingle of harness. Jonah shifted on the hard bench, unused to conversation that went beyond trading pleasantries with storekeepers. 8 years, he replied, then felt compelled to add, "Since my wife died." The words fell between them, like stones into still water, creating ripples he couldn't take back. He'd never spoken of Sarah to anyone, had kept her memory locked away like a precious thing too fragile for the light. But something about Lydia's presence made honesty feel less like weakness and more like necessity. She nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. "I lost my husband 6 months ago," she said quietly, her hand moving in small circles over her belly. "Fever took him just as we learned about the baby." The simple statement carried a weight that made Jonah's chest tighten. Here was a woman who'd lost everything: husband, security, the future they'd planned together, and yet she radiated a peace that he'd never managed to find in all his years of mountain solitude. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than any words he'd spoken in years. Lydia turned to look at him then, really look at him, and Jonah felt exposed under that gentle gaze, as if she could see straight through to the broken places he'd spent so long hiding. The cabin came into view as they rounded the final bend, a sturdy log structure nestled against a stand of pine trees with smoke rising from the chimney. Jonah had built it with his own hands in those first raw months after Sarah's death, pouring his grief into every notched log and fitted stone. It was a good cabin, solid and warm, but it had never been a home, just a place to exist, to wait out the years until his own time came. But seeing it now through Lydia's eyes, he felt a strange stirring of something that might have been pride. "It's beautiful," she breathed, and Jonah realized she meant it. The simple appreciation in her voice made him see his refuge differently, as if her presence had already begun to transform the space from shelter into sanctuary. He helped her down from the stagecoach, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her carefully to the ground. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. Not desire exactly, but recognition, as if his body remembered what it meant to touch another human being with tenderness. Lydia's cheeks flushed pink from the cold, and perhaps something else, and for a moment they stood there in the fading afternoon light, two wounded souls on the threshold of something neither quite understood. The driver unloaded her single trunk and a worn carpet bag, accepting Jonah's payment with the tip of his hat before climbing back onto his perch. As the stagecoach disappeared down the mountain path, Jonah felt the weight of solitude lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something far more terrifying: responsibility for another person's well-being. "Shall we go inside?" Lydia asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood the magnitude of this moment as clearly as he did. Jonah nodded, lifting her trunk as if it weighed nothing, though he suspected the real weight lay not in her possessions, but in the hope she carried with her. As they walked toward the cabin door, he caught the scent of lavender in her hair and felt something long dormant stir in his chest. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, but for the first time in 8 years, it didn't sound like morning. It sounded like welcome, like the earth itself was celebrating the return of life to this lonely place. Jonah Kane had hired a cook, but as he opened the door to his cabin and gestured for Lydia Brown to enter, he realized he might have invited salvation itself to take up residence in his carefully guarded heart. Escrevos Capítulos 3:5. The third morning arrived with frost painting the windows like delicate lace, and Jonah found himself lingering at the kitchen table longer than necessary. Lydia moved through his space with the quiet confidence of a woman who understood that healing happened in small gestures, the way she arranged wildflowers in a mason jar, how she hummed softly while kneading dough, the gentle manner in which she placed his coffee cup exactly where his hand would naturally reach. Her presence had begun to transform the cabin from a mere shelter into something that whispered of home, though Jonah fought against acknowledging this dangerous shift in his carefully constructed solitude. When she asked him about the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, Jonah's instinct was to retreat into the familiar armor of silence. But something in her eyes, not pity, not curiosity, but a kind of patient understanding, loosened the words from his throat like stones from a dam. He told her about the bear attack 3 winters ago, how he'd lain bleeding in the snow for hours, certain he would die alone as he had lived. Lydia listened without interruption, her hands never pausing in their work of braiding her dark hair, and when he finished, she simply nodded and said, "The mountains test us all differently, but they also teach us what we're truly made of." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, old Pete Morrison from the valley, riding up with news that the winter would be harsh and supplies scarce. Jonah watched from the doorway as Lydia invited the weathered man inside, poured him coffee, and listened to his stories with the same attention she gave everything else. Pete's eyes kept drifting to her rounded belly, then to Jonah, and the unspoken questions hung in the air like smoke. When the old man finally departed, he pressed Lydia's hand and whispered something that made her smile. The first real smile Jonah had seen illuminate her face since her arrival. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Lydia spoke of her late husband for the first time. Thomas had been a gentleman, she said, a schoolteacher who believed in the power of words to heal wounds and build bridges between hearts. He had died of fever just as the first snows began, leaving her with nothing but his books and the child growing beneath her heart. Her voice remained steady as she spoke, but Jonah saw how her hands trembled slightly as they rested on her belly, protecting the life within from a world that had already proven itself capable of sudden, devastating loss. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but sacred, filled with the weight of shared understanding. Jonah found himself studying the way the firelight played across her features, how it softened the lines of worry around her eyes and made her seem almost ethereal in the golden glow. He had spent years believing that solitude was strength, that needing no one was the highest form of freedom. But watching Lydia, her quiet courage, her unwavering faith in tomorrow despite yesterday's losses, he began to suspect that perhaps the strongest people were those who dared to remain open to love even after it had wounded them. When she rose to bank the fire for the night, Jonah surprised himself by speaking. "Your husband," he said quietly. "He was a lucky man." Lydia paused, her hand on the poker, and turned to look at him with those eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "No," she replied softly, "I was the lucky one. Love, real love, it changes you forever, makes you better than you ever thought you could be." As she disappeared into her small room, Jonah sat alone in the dying firelight, wondering if a man like him, scarred and solitary and set in his ways, could ever be worthy of such transformative grace. The fourth week brought a blizzard that raged for 3 days, trapping them together in the cabin's warm embrace, while the world outside disappeared beneath a blanket of white fury. Jonah had weathered countless storms alone, finding a strange comfort in the howling wind and the way it made his isolation feel chosen rather than imposed. But now, with Lydia moving quietly through the rooms, her presence made the storm feel different. Not like nature's assault on his solitude, but like the world's way of giving them time to discover what was growing between them in the spaces where words fell short. On the second day of the storm, Lydia's back began to ache from the weight she carried, and Jonah found himself offering to help her with tasks that had always been hers alone. His large, calloused hands proved surprisingly gentle as he helped her hang laundry by the fire, and when she winced while reaching for something on a high shelf, he was there before she could ask, his body close enough that she could smell the pine and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his skin. These small intimacies, the brush of fingers when passing a cup, the way he steadied her elbow when she rose from a chair, began to weave a web of connection that neither acknowledged but both felt, pulling them towards something neither had planned. The baby chose that second evening to make its presence known with a series of strong kicks that left Lydia breathless and laughing despite herself. Without thinking, she reached for Jonah's hand and placed it on her belly, wanting to share this miracle of life with someone who understood the preciousness of survival. Jonah's breath caught as he felt the child move beneath his palm. This tiny life that would soon enter a world that could be both beautiful and brutal. In that moment, something shifted in his chest, a wall crumbling that he hadn't even realized he'd built around his heart. And he understood that he was no longer just sheltering a woman in need, but protecting a future that had somehow become precious to him. The storm's third night brought with it a different kind of tempest, one that raged in Jonah's soul as he lay awake listening to the wind and the soft sounds of Lydia's breathing from the next room. He had spent years convincing himself that he was content with his solitary existence, that the mountains and the silence were enough to fill the empty spaces in his life. But Lydia's presence had awakened hungers he thought he'd buried. Not just for companionship, but for the kind of love that transformed ordinary moments into something sacred, that made a man want to be better than he'd ever imagined possible. When morning finally broke clear and bright, revealing a world transformed by snow into something pristine and new, Jonah found Lydia standing at the window, with tears streaming down her face. For a moment, panic seized him. Was she hurt? Was the baby coming too soon? But when she turned to him, her smile was radiant despite the tears. "It's so beautiful," she whispered. "Thomas would have loved this. He always said that after every storm, the world gets a chance to start over, clean and fresh and full of possibility." Jonah moved to stand beside her, their shoulders touching as they gazed out at the unmarked snow, and he realized that she was right. The storm had indeed given them a chance to begin again. As they worked together to dig out from the storm's aftermath, Jonah caught himself watching Lydia with a new awareness, seeing not just the woman who had brought order to his chaos, but the one who had brought light to his darkness. When she laughed at something, he said, a rare moment of humor from a man who had forgotten how to be playful. The sound seemed to echo off the mountains themselves, and Jonah understood that he was falling in love not just with her, but with the man he became when he was with her. The storm had passed, but the transformation it had wrought in his heart would endure long after the snow melted and spring returned to claim the mountain once more. March arrived with the tentative whispers of change, ice beginning to crack along the creek, the first brave shoots of green pushing through the snow, and a restlessness in Lydia that spoke of the approaching time when new life would demand its place in the world. Jonah found himself watching her with increasing protectiveness, noting how she pressed her hand to her lower back more frequently, how she paused sometimes in her work to breathe through what he was learning to recognize as the body's preparation for the monumental task ahead. The nearest doctor was a day's ride down the mountain, and the thought of that journey, of what might happen if the baby came early, filled him with a fear more profound than any he had faced in his solitary battles with nature. One morning, as Lydia struggled to rise from bed, Jonah made a decision that surprised them both. "I'm riding down to fetch Doc Henderson," he announced, already reaching for his coat. "He needs to come up here, check on you and the baby, make sure everything's as it should be." Lydia protested that it wasn't necessary, that women had been having babies without doctors for centuries, but Jonah's jaw was set in that stubborn line she had come to recognize. "Maybe so," he said quietly, "but this baby, your baby, it matters to me now, and I won't take chances with either of you." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to voice. The doctor's visit confirmed what Jonah's heart already knew. The baby would come soon, within the month, and Lydia was strong and healthy, despite the hardships she had endured. But Doc Henderson pulled Jonah aside before leaving, his weathered face serious. "She's going to need more than medical care when that baby comes," he said quietly. "She's going to need someone who'll stand by her, help her raise that child. Mountain life is hard enough without trying to do it alone." Jonah nodded, understanding the weight of what the old doctor was really saying, feeling the responsibility settle on his shoulders like a mantle he was finally ready to wear. That evening, as they sat by the fire with the spring rain drumming against the windows, Lydia spoke the words that had been building between them for weeks. "Jonah," she said softly, her hands resting on her belly, "I need you to know that whatever happens, these months with you have been a gift. You've given me more than shelter. You've given me hope that there's still goodness in the world, still men who know how to be gentle with broken things." Her voice caught slightly, and Jonah felt his own throat tighten with emotions he had no words for. "You're not broken," he said finally, his voice rough with feeling. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. And this baby, it's going to be lucky to have you for a mother." The conversation that followed was halting, full of pauses and careful words, but it changed everything between them. Jonah spoke of his loneliness, of the years he had spent convincing himself that isolation was strength, of how her presence had shown him the difference between being alone and being lonely. Lydia shared her fears about raising a child without its father, about whether she could be enough for the life growing inside her, about the guilt she felt for finding happiness again when Thomas was gone. They talked until the fire burned low, their words weaving a new understanding between them, an acknowledgement that what had begun as a practical arrangement had become something neither had expected but both desperately needed. When Lydia's labor began 3 weeks later, on a morning when the mountain laurel was just beginning to bloom, Jonah was ready. He had prepared everything Doc Henderson had told him to prepare, but more than that, he had prepared his heart for the moment when he would help bring new life into the world. As he held Lydia's hand through the long hours of labor, whispering words of encouragement and strength, Jonah understood that he was witnessing more than birth. He was witnessing resurrection, the triumph of hope over despair, of love over loss. When the baby's first cry echoed through the cabin, mixing with Lydia's tears of joy and relief, Jonah knew that his old life had ended and a new one had begun. One where he was no longer just a mountain man living in solitude, but a man who had learned that the greatest strength came not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand with someone else, come what may.